So today we'll be looking at what makes a megacity, the challenges facing London as it grows into a megacity, and how engineers and artists collaborate and inspire each other, as well as future innovations taking place. So my name's Rachel Williams, and I'm the assistant producer for the Megacity London Engineering Our Future season, supported by the Royal Academy of Engineering. Here at Guerilla Science, we develop collaborations between artists and scientists across all of our projects to develop entertaining and participatory events and installations for the public, for everyone really, to discover science in unexpected ways. We usually host tents and spectacles across a large range of festivals, take over buildings, run supper clubs, and partner with cultural spaces in the UK and the USA. However, this year, we've been adapting from hosting live events to developing online events, such as the Megacity London online season. So Megacity London, at its heart, brings together engineers and artists to explore the city's future as the population rises above 10 million people and reflect on the challenges that we may face. And today we're joined by the artists who've created all of the amazing work we've been sharing this week, as well as 3 of the 11 engineers and architects whose real life work the art is based on. So I'll introduce our speakers for today. Our first artist is Sprankenstein, artist, animator, and creator of Tunnel Vision. Hi. Our second artist is Stephanie Bickford-Smith, artist and designer who's created Wind and 2 pieces yet to be released, Rain and Sun. So Stephanie is joining us in voice only because of course, you know, it's 2020, we're on Zoom. It was gonna be one of us. And unfortunately, fate has chosen Steph. And we're also joined by Emily Farmer, graduate tunnel engineer from Mott MacDonald, as well as Stuart Norris, structural engineer from Mott MacDonald. And last but not least, Carol Costello, architect and director at Cullinan Studio, who are developing a project in partnership with London South Bank University, which we'll be getting to later in the discussion. So I think it's time, you know, to bring some others into the conversation. It's not all about me. So I think we'll start off just a bit of background and getting to know each other. So Sprankenstein, what attracted you to becoming an artist, and what was your path into becoming an artist?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
To be honest, I was never intending to be an artist whatsoever. So when I was younger, it was definitely more academics and not so much science, but history and maths and things like that. And I didn't do particularly well towards the more like late teens. I think I'd lost interest by that point. And I just had to pick up something else, and it happened to be A-level art. And then from there, I didn't really look back. It kind of all fell into place. And I spent a lot of my childhood sort of doodling characters and drawing, but I never put 2 and 2 together for it to be something that I pursued as a passion and as a career. So yeah, I think, well, my family actually, my dad's side is quite artistic as well. So I think that probably comes into it as well. My grandma was a fine artist, and my granddad's an architect. So maybe there was something there as well that I hadn't tapped into until later teens. But yeah, once I took that AS level, it kind of all fell into place, and I carried on into further education, then freelance work, and then opening my own studio. But yeah, I've always been interested in sort of like Japanese manga cartoons and anime and things like that. So I was always sort of just doodling those characters for a while, just, you know, just copying them to the exact thing. And then I realised I could make my own, and then that was it, really.
That's wonderful. It's such a wonderful route in as well, I think. And I think there are similar moments in science as well, where at first you just love learning facts, but then later you find out you can do your own experiments, you know, which may be a little bit inconvenient for those around you, but still, that's fantastic. Thank you. And Stephanie, I'll ask the same question to you. What attracted you to becoming an artist, and were there any similarities or differences to Sprankenstein's journey?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, I first went to art school when I was 7, And that was with my mum, who was actually a mature art foundation student. And my mum, I guess she could probably sense my creative spirit and sort of playful nature as a kid. And on rare occasions, she would take me out of school to join her in her studio. So kind of from seeing the playful, creative world of art school from such an early age, I just sort of stuck to that as my way of life. And then from that, I've just sort of built in collaborating with people from other disciplines, basically.
Wow, thank you. So art's always kind of been your playground. And then the question is, who are you playing with?
Mm-hmm.
And I think going to Carol next, kind of, so you're on a slightly different path as an architect. What kind of brought you there?
Well, I suppose as a child, I loved art, but I also loved science and math, particularly geometry, and got to, end of high school in America, because I'm an American. But so I thought art and science were good foundation for doing architecture. But I'd never met an architect in my life. And I was the first generation to go to university. So my dad was a butcher and mom was a housewife. So I was very naive, but I persevered. And it's a long haul to become an architect because you have a degree and then there's a postgrad and then you have to do your professional qualification. And I suppose this is in the context of a very male-dominated world. So, a lot of women drop out of architecture or don't even bother to qualify, although the percentage of women in university courses is always usually 50-50, and often they're the top students, but I think that's changing now. So not to get too depressed about that, but it's a long haul. And, architecture needs a much more diverse makeup because, we shape cities.
Yeah, that's a brilliant tagline for the whole thing, really, isn't it? We shape cities.
So we need to have a good representation, and that's another thing. I think when architects are working with clients and communities, there's a lot of forward thinking about co-design and consultation and doing that well, and it always makes the design better when you do that. So,
and I definitely think you're right. The more the merrier when it comes to diversity in all of these industries. And I think it's been really great in Megacity London to be able to work with so many amazing women, which leads me on to Emily. Emily, what was your kind of path to becoming an engineer? And was it similar for you? Was it something you wanted to do since you were a child, or how did you know?
Well, so a bit like Carol, it was like a bit of a leap of faith. I didn't just know for my whole life that I wanted to be an engineer. I wasn't like how you imagine it, like always playing with Lego when I was younger. It wasn't like I've always had a passion, and it's not always been like the only path for me. But when I was in school, I was just the ultimate geek. I just love maths and love science, especially like the maths side of physics. And then after school, I wanted to go to university, and I wanted to do something that I really enjoyed, that embraced my geekiness, but kind of close, like put me on a path as well, so I didn't leave university and still not know what I wanted to do. So I just had a little look around and found engineering and thought, yeah, that sounds cool. Buildings are cool, bridges are cool. I'll have a go at that. And so I signed up for a 3-year normal bachelor's at Cardiff University. And then when I was there, I extended to do a year in industry. So a lot of universities give you the opportunity to practice in the field before you qualify. So I worked on a building site for a year and realised that was for me. So I then carried on, and next thing I did a master's. So I ended up going to uni for 5 years. So like Carol, it was quite a long commitment, but it was quite lucky at the same time because I didn't plan to do that. I just realised that I loved it as I went through. And then, so after university, I then was looking at what part of the industry I wanted to go in, because that's partly why engineering is so great, because it's so varied. It's like there's so much variety even within civil engineering. So I went into tunnel design, again, not something I'd really done before, and now I've been doing tunnel engineering for 2 years. So I'm still quite new to the industry, but yeah.
Fantastic. That is amazing. And Stuart, you know, you're also in the kind of area of tunnels. What was your path to that point?
So I think I was pretty different from Emily, to be fair. I was your cliche sort of Lego kid. I was always sort of building different little structures with my Lego. And actually my path probably started when I was quite young. So my dad had a career in housing, and from him, sort of little conversation-y bits, I sort of learned a bit about what architecture was. I think he sort of pushed me in that kind of direction. He wanted to see me as an architect kind of thing. And so I thought, oh, I'll do that. And then I thought all that through my sort of early teens, sort of up until you do sort of your work experience when you're sort of 14, 15. And so I went and did a work experience with an architect, and I liked it, but whilst I was there, I met a structural engineer, and actually I really liked the work that they did, as opposed to slightly different to architecture, and I really preferred their kind of work. So from there, I sort of asked around, found some friends, and I found someone who their dad was a structural engineer, and I sort of went along with them to their work for a week or so during sixth form. And I thought, yes, I really like this. This is what I want to do. So then I went and studied at Sheffield, and I did a degree in structural engineering. And then whilst you're there, they sort of help you in terms of getting placements and things. So I did a placement with Mott MacDonald. I liked Mott MacDonald. I liked working on sort of the heavy civil side of structures. So I've been here ever since, basically. So yeah, I'm 3 years in now.
That's amazing. And yeah, there's definitely room for the Lego kids and the art kids. We're all here together. So I guess now, like, I feel like that's been really nice, just hearing all of those different journeys and stories leading to this, you know, life-changing moment. But I guess going back to like the meat of what the season is all about, Emily, it would be great to hear from you. How does a city become classified as a megacity?
So, well, in my opinion, the immediate stereotype, or the first thing you think of, is that it's got a huge population, which is obviously true, and it's mostly defined by population size. But to me, like, a city becomes a megacity when it's like, it's not overnight, it suddenly changes. The cities are constantly growing, they're always getting bigger, and then they get so big that they become a megacity. So to me, that means that they're like so incomprehensible in size, you can't even imagine what that means. Like, London is not a megacity yet, and London to me seems absolutely huge, but it's so much more than just the size and the way the city. It's more about how the city runs and how it interacts with different communities. So it's definitely more of a way of connecting a country. So it's always going to be the epicenter of a country or of a nation. And a lot of the economy within that country will depend on the city. But then this massive footprint in location and in population size will create opportunities and challenges. So a lot of megacities, there's the opportunities for some great innovative design or new growth. But especially in the past, I would say a lot of megacities have developed quite unsustainably because it's not being prepared for. It's quite patchwork. You know, it's not going to be a grid. There'll just be bits added on here and there. And then that can lead to quite a disparity of access of basic needs and basic infrastructure that a lot of people need. But then when you look at the other side, a megacity is such a great like melting pot of cultures and diversity, and brings together so many different things. You know, you have things next door to each other that you would never imagine being in the same eyesight, and you have different communities that become one community. So it's mostly like, in my opinion, well, the good side is embracing all the different disparities you get in a city, but that in itself will bring challenges in its development.
Definitely. And I guess, Stuart, to you, how many megacities are there out there right now? And kind of when will London hit that point of becoming a megacity?
Yeah, so I mean, as with all these things, there are different sources for these kind of bits of information. So there's lots of different answers. I mean, what really is a megacity kind of thing? If you do it based purely on population, I think there's somewhere between 30 and 40 megacities right now. And that obviously changes depending on how you look at it and how big you take the city as, and things like that. And another criteria that people often use is sort of population density. So I think if you've got more than 2,000 people per square kilometre, that makes it a bit more of a megacity kind of thing. If you're talking about London, that becoming a megacity, I had a look at the numbers. Every year, the Office for National Statistics, they try and predict the population growth in London. And I think last year they predicted that in 2035, that would be the sort of point where London tips into a megacity, when the population in the Greater London area jumps above that 10 million mark, which is your normal megacity kind of cutoff. Sorry, there's obviously factors that affect that. So there's lots of political stuff, and then there'll be obviously the situation we're going through right now might change that. So between 10 and 20 years, you might see London as a megacity.
Wow.
But
And
interestingly,
yeah,
sorry,
go on.
if you ignore London as a sort of Greater London and take in the whole commuter area for London, it's already well beyond that 10 million mark. And actually the number of people that are interfacing with London already, that could be considered to be, you know, greater than the 10 mil and making it a megacity kind of thing. So
yeah, and all of that is so fascinating, because when we were originally researching for the project, you know, and looking at articles from the past few years, you know, that date was like 2050, we're going to become a megacity, and now it's like 2035. It's just so like interesting to see how the city's already evolving and changing. And I wonder, Carol, as an architect, what would you say the future of London might look like as a megacity, and where will those pressures be?
Well, it's interesting because I sort of agree. I've lived here for 30 years because I came here as a postgrad student, and it already feels like a megacity to me when I compare it to what it was like when I first came, because access to certain things because of overcrowding is making it more difficult, I think, and the systems are creaking. So interesting, the pandemic comes and puts a halt on a lot of those issues. But what people are saying, and you can see with government's funding about building back greener and different bits of green infrastructure fund, there's a huge yearning to fix some of the chronic problems. My hope is whatever size it is, it's a green city and it has balance to it and it addresses some of the inequality, because for a lot of people, parts of this city are really unnatural, unhealthy, and unfair. And if you're an optimist, you've got to want that to change. So that's where I am on that. It needs to be everything kind of in moderation and lots of generosity and sharing of the competition for space.
Yeah, totally. And I'm a Londoner as well myself, and have had family in the kind of Elephant and Castle area until very recently, as a result of gentrification. Like,
so I know that South London thing.
yeah, so different now.
I've seen a lot of change.
Yeah. And Stuart, as an engineer, do you have a kind of like parallel perspective to what London might look like as a megacity? Like, if you already touched on some of those points.
So yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Carol is saying, that I think London should keep its sort of green kind of feel to it compared to sort of other big cities. I think London is quite a green city, and hopefully as we develop going forward, it becomes even fairer than it is now. It gets a lot fairer. I personally see London getting a bit more urban than it is now, especially in sort of the suburby kind of areas. I don't really see us going in the way of sort of urban sprawl, like when you keep spreading out and out and out. I don't really see us going that way. So hopefully, you know, we manage to develop these sort of suburbs into more urban areas, but maintaining that green kind of fair feel. And I mean, there's lots of engineering challenges that go alongside having more people in a tighter space. So it's really interesting to see, you know, how that will develop going forward.
And Sprankenstein, I suppose you've been quite inspired by Stuart's work on Thames Tideway. We'll get to it in a little bit. And you've been looking at the challenges facing London below ground. So which kind of areas of engineering inspired Tunnel Vision, and what were the challenges that they're trying to solve?
I I think my main focus for tunnel vision was the sewer system, and the issues that London was facing, with sort of upgrading it from what it was, from like the 2 million it was built for the 10 million we're approaching, or like Stuart said, probably it was already coming in and out. And it was a sort of, I was taking into account sort of how things were built in the Victorian age, and how Stuart was talking about how they're going to be built for the Thames Tideway and the different materials and things. And also just making this tunnel structure felt like a piece of engineering in itself that I've never done before. So it felt quite apt. And yeah, just sort of like the considerations of how to even build it, and then to the differentiation between the Victorian and the sewer now. Yeah, so it's definitely, it felt like a structural engineering thing in its own way. I don't know if I've completely got your, what your job is titled down, but yeah, sorry, I lost track then, what I was saying.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting watching you guys kind of develop these ideas over the past few weeks, and yeah, just really interesting to see where the art comes from in that sense. And I suppose, Stephanie, you were looking at the other side of the coin, at the challenges facing London above ground. So what was your inspiration for creating Wind, Sun and Rain? If you're speaking, Stephanie, I can't quite hear you, just to let you know.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yep, can hear you now, brilliant.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Sorry for my technical issues. I'm really sorry.
No problem.
So yeah, so I've been looking at above ground, and I was interested in looking at the megacities in the future, and like the London megacity from a social perspective. And I was sort of thinking about how will inhabitants find a sense of space in this hyperdensity of this future built environment. And I was kind of thinking about like going to kind of what Carol was saying as well, was interesting about green spaces, and how will these citizens have access to green spaces and benefit from green spaces, and what are those benefits we get from those spaces. And so this was a kind of perspective I was coming into the project and the interviews. And then from talking to the engineers, when we were kind of talking about structure design, and I was asking questions around, how does nature affect the building, like in its state of development, so what materials are used and how it's built. Someone mentioned fluid mechanics, and my ears kind of propped up, and I found this really interesting about the flow of gases and liquids in between buildings. And I found it interesting to kind of then start like questioning, like, so instead of like thinking about muting these elements, so how we kind of mute or soften wind tunnels, for example, what if we actually saw them more as like opportunities, as new kind of green spaces, as ways to connect to movements outside of the human interaction with the space in the city. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, fantastic. And it's wonderful how all of those different elements can kind of come together to create this like really stunning artwork. And I suppose moving from green spaces into green skies, Carol, you're developing a project in partnership with London South Bank University called GreenSCIES. Could you tell us a little bit about it and how it will affect local communities?
Yeah, so it's an ultra-low 5th generation heat network. And basically what that means is they're using waste heat from places like the London Underground, which we know has a lot of heat built up in it, and data centers and other buildings, office buildings, supermarkets, whatever. And taking that heat and using a low temperature hot water, low temperature heat network to pump that heat to homes. And this is in Islington. And the main objective of it is to reduce fuel poverty. That's Islington's main objective, but also it's part of their roadmap to net zero by 2030. So it's an amazing project to be a part of. And we are with big partnership. It's funded by Innovate UK. London South Bank University are leading it, but we're working with lots of specialist engineers. And part of it is co-design. So what I was talking about earlier, we are consulting the local community, and we're looking at all sorts of ways of how you get the heat network through a very, Islington's the densest part of London, probably of the UK, in terms of population. So it's how you get this new infrastructure integrated into the city. And our involvement as architects is to kind of visualize it. So we're doing lots of graphics and animations, and that helps communicate kind of an abstract idea to the community. But we also did a energy center on the city road, which is the first of its kind in the world, with Islington and Ramble and Transport for London. And it takes waste heat from the London Underground. That's a hot water temperature network. So that's how we got into it, because we've done this energy center. So we were able to collaborate on this research.
Amazing. Yeah, that's really wonderful. And I think as well, you're kind of touching on that element of transport and of dense communities. And I think that links really nicely potentially to Emily, if you can share with us some of the types of projects that you're working on and maybe the social benefits they'll have to communities.
Yeah, so I have been, since I started with Mott MacDonald, I've been working on like mega transport projects. So I've worked on 2 different ones which kind of show the examples of how mega cities are developing. So one of the projects has been looking at better connectivity across London. So it's the opportunity to create a new tube line under London. And the other is looking at ways to connect London to other cities. So both are via rail. So the idea is to use what we've got in the end locations and to connect them in a new, faster or more efficient way to help improve the movement of people around cities and between cities. So it's interesting to see how this will affect the economy and the social values of people, because there's kind of 2 main aspects. Is that the construction on its own, before it's even used, is such a huge part of the economy. The construction industry is often considered as like one of the backbone industries to the economy, especially in economic crisis, which we might be looming into. These sort of industries are really good to help pull economies through and help improve the amount of jobs and the opportunities for people in cities. But then also when you look at the long-term impacts, at the long-term nature of these projects and the end users, you're helping to connect people regardless of their location. So the location just suddenly becomes almost redundant, but in a way where London as a megacity will become accessible to people that don't live there as well. Like as Stuart was saying, if you look at the pool of people that come into London, it's huge. So the idea is to try and connect these people in a seamless way and not have the current issues and the current negative connotations that you have either coming into London or travelling across London.
Right.
Then it's the opportunity of trying to do this in the way of reducing the use of cars and making them green at the same time, to have that sustainable growth.
Yeah, and I think if we take that kind of sustainable outlook as well, Stephanie, then in kind of connecting everything to nature and experience of nature, what type of audiences are you looking to reach with your practice, and more generally as well? And what kind of impact are you hoping to bring about there?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, all good.
Is that working? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep. Okay, great. Sorry, I have to keep checking. My connection is very poor at the moment. So yeah, so I guess like I'm interested, I'm kind of interested in gauging a kind of a conversation with, well, I guess as Carol said, like the kind of people, the professionals who are shaping the cities. And so, you know, that's including engineers, architects, think tanks. And I'm just sort of interested in kind of drawing up and bringing attention to the kind of quieter areas to reflect upon. So thinking about sort of the day-to-day lifestyles of living in these new cities and these buildings, and what are these little details that we might be able to think about now in our designing and planning that we could then kind of help make the future lives better, basically. Yeah.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you, Stephanie. And Sprankenstein, kind of same question to you. As an artist and an animator, who are you trying to reach with your work, and what kind of impact do you hope you'll have? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it's all right. I started the trend.
Yeah. I think in general, I've always, in a more broader sense of my practice and who I'm trying to reach, is I like to sort of delve into more sort of like mental health, emotional reactions to things. I like to try and reduce stigma on mental health in general. So any personal work I do, it's usually got a touch of things like just sort of looking at negative emotions in a different way and realizing we have to experience them all and take them for good, not bad. So I do a lot of work with emotions like pain and misery, sorrow, all the things that people look in a bad way, and I try and portray them in a way that is more positive and necessity of life as characters, almost being like sort of, you know, hey, I've got to be here. So there's always a touch of that in the background of any work I do, project allowing. Sometimes I'll get a lyric video and it's not possible to do that. But so I generally like to portray a message in some way or form, whether it's obvious or not, especially within some animations and things, if it's character based. And it's the same even for this tunnel vision project. I like to evoke a feeling, whether you know it's happening or not. And by creating something that's, you know, dark and the tunnel projections, you can't help but have some sort of reaction to it, whether it's like a visual sort of lightning in your brain kind of thing, or an emotional reaction, or a bit like, what the hell is this reaction? And some of the, like, for example, the oscilloscope work we did at the end of the tunnel, the sound waves for that it's manic. It's like, it gets right under your skin. And I quite like doing that, like making that happen, and just have people get sort of jolted or something. I think it's quite, it could be an uncomfortable experience, but I think it's quite, I think it's a good one. Yeah, like there's always emotion within my work, and that is a key thing. And I think if I do work without emotion, I'm not really invested, and you can tell. So I like to try, and even if the brief or the project that we get in the studio is not steered that way, try and wangle it in. So just so there's, yeah, it's important to be passionate about what you're doing.
Always. And I think I've kind of picked that up from tunnel vision, where you kind of include this being that lives in the super sewer, and that's kind of like, it's kind of an ominous being that, you know, whether it's here now or here in 2035, like it's gonna be here. I feel like the way that's been wrapped in really makes the kind of engineering basis of it come alive. So yeah, I love that. And if anybody's curious, we've got one video on tunnel vision on YouTube. There'll be more throughout the week, so keep checking our social media for more of that work. So I suppose now I'll turn the conversation a little to the interdisciplinary collaborations that have been fostered throughout the project. And I suppose, Carol, if we talk about one that's been, you know, pre-existing Megacity London and continuing on through it, Cullinan Studio has been working with London South Bank University on GreenSCIES. And are there any areas of this work that will continue to inspire your architectural work at Cullinan Studio?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think being an architect's quite a tough job, long hours, but it's never boring. And one of the most exciting parts of it is the collaboration with engineers, because there's a tension. We push each other because we're kind of coming at it from different ways, but it's always like, well, what if we did this? And what if we did that? And what's great as well with working with academics as well on a research project like GreenSCIES is a little bit more blue sky, you know, and we do have timeframes and budgets and everything, but we're really kind of pushing it a bit further, like hypothetically, what if we did this? And one of the aspects of it is actually looking about, you know, one of the barriers to heat networks, district heat networks, is digging up the roads. So we've been challenged like, well, what if you take the pipes above ground? And then what does that mean? And then we're kind of coming back and saying, well, what will people think about that? Yeah. And could you put plants around them? Could you do all this? So in some ways, it feels a little bit mad. But we're working on it very seriously with them, and we will draw conclusions from that, and it's a scheme that is, you know, bound to be implemented.
Yeah, that kind of element of chaos or, you know, friction between you kind of creating something wonderful at the end. And I suppose, Stuart, now back to the engineer side of things, through your artistic collaboration, have you encountered any unexpected similarities in the way that you work?
Yes, I think the collaboration has actually been really interesting. I think it's quite easy for engineers to assume that artists are sort of completely different. They're a completely different sort of discipline. It's a different thing entirely. But actually, I've been thinking about it a bit, and you kind of tend to notice that both sides are kind of problem solvers. They're both sort of working for a client, got to get to a solution at the end of it. And in a way, there are similarities in that, you know, if you give two different engineers the same problem, you'll get very different answers. And that's kind of the same parallel in the art world, where you give two different artists a similar-ish brief, you end up with two very different things. And I think that's generally a benefit in the art world, in the same way that it's a benefit in the engineering world. There's lots of different ideas going around. There's no absolute sort of right answer. I guess one thing that was sort of unexpected as going through this is, in my head, I know this to be completely wrong now, but when I was thinking about sort of artists, I was thinking of sort of like Van Gogh type, sort of sat in a room, sort of you're in your own ideas. But actually, there's so much research and development that goes into it in terms of the art world, and that's kind of the exact same parallel to what we do, where it's like we have to do just as much kind of research to come to our sort of solutions. So
I think that's just so wonderful to have a new perspective on, you know, what art is, how art is made, in the same way that, you know, innovation is created and science is researched, and, you know, that active process behind it. And I suppose Sprankenstein, like, were there any areas of engineering that you might pull into your work further? You've already discussed kind of building the tunnel.
Yeah, I think I've got a taste for it now, to be honest. I've been thinking about what's the next thing I can build. It's been one of the most interesting projects I've done in a few years. And just that the methodology of creating something and the things you have to account for, which is very similar to engineering, like I said before, is like how you move through the tunnel, you know, where to place certain things, like how we had to sort of like plan out where to cut the holes for the oscilloscope and how the eye works and the animations behind the eye. It was so considered, and it's not something I've had a chance to do ever. So it's definitely something I think I'm going to push forward to try and continue, especially as not so much as a studio creative, but as an artist. Like I said, I've got an itch for it now. So
that's fantastic. Yes, more Sprankenstein builds.
Yeah, just more tunnels. I'll do an even bigger one.
Yeah. Amazing. And Emily, you know, from your perspective, what have you learnt from collaborating with artists?
I think it's been interesting to see the amount of there is so many things that we do in the same way. Often I have the stereotype that, society has the stereotype that people are either arty or sciencey, and they're both extremes that aren't related or aren't interlinked. But actually, everyone is a blend of the two, and especially the sort of engineering that we're working on at the moment, Stuart and I, where we're looking at ways to solve problems that haven't existed in the past. all that involves being extremely creative, because a lot of the things we're doing are innovative, or trying to be more efficient than they've been before, or being of a better quality, of a better experience. And these sort of things all require the creativity that you get from having an artistic flair in some way. This problem-solving nature and creating unique things is where I would say we do really cross over. And as like Sprankenstein was saying, it's interesting to see now, I've seen that there's a big shift for the end user to like tap into all your senses, to not just be efficient in everything you're doing, but to create positive experiences for everything. Because often engineers have an initial thought to create something that's uber efficient, or the cheapest or the best quality building, say. But actually, when you look at it from the artistic perspective more, it's the end user that you should be considering throughout the whole process, which is what I've learned so much from this collaboration.
Amazing. And I think it's just so interesting you bring up that word experience. And I think as well, you know, Stephanie, and your work kind of prior to Megacity London, but also during the project, it's so much about experience and that kind of embodiment of what it is to live in the city. And I wonder whether any areas of the engineering and that kind of knowledge there that you're now able to pull when you're thinking about how somebody experiences a city and how someone might experience your work as well.
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. I think after reading through all the interviews with all the engineers that you've been working with for the megacities, a kind of common theme that I read through was that when asked what do engineers do and what is engineering, was that they work with real people and make real change in the city, change to lifestyles and environments. And I feel with my work as an artist, I often, it can be quite easy to start creating work, not easy, but I can find a tendency to start creating work that's talking about futures or other realities, alternative realities. And I think that I would like to hope that I could focus more on real time and real space, and see how I can also use my skills more to create change, as well as opening dialogues. And since I've released the first film, Wind, I've had a friend who's a physiotherapist who's contacted me saying that she found that she asked my permission to use the film to help with her patients in recovery, because she felt that it was very good to create a sense of headspace whilst they're processing through trauma. And I found that for me, this was like really exciting, because it was an indirect happy result from this whole collaborative project. So I incorporate that approach more in my future work.
And that's fascinating. It's so wonderful that already you're kind of seeing these, like real-time benefits and social benefits to this collaboration. Like, that's so wonderful to hear. And yeah, I hope lots of people can get that kind of feeling from it. Like, I've really enjoyed like listening to that kind of narration throughout the film. Is, it's very soothing. It kind of embodies the wind, but it makes you feel very mindful of kind of what's going on around you as well. So again, I know I'm biased, but I highly recommend everyone checks out the artworks. And I think we're coming towards the end of like the questions that we had prepared before. If anyone's got any questions from who's listening in now, then feel free to pop them in at any point, or try and come up with something while we do the final section. But yeah, like working with all of you and has just been really, really great for me as well. I feel like my eyes have opened to the world of engineering and the world of art and the potential for them to work together. And I guess, it's great to have you here, because you do have that expertise on what is going on and what is yet to come. And I think, Carol, I'll start with you. Are there any architectural innovations which you think have that exciting potential to benefit megacities of the future?
Well, the thing I'm personally most excited about is urban food growing. And from a personal level, I'm part of Edible Lambeth, and we have a community food growing space that's basically a bit of land that on a council estate that was used for dog poop and all that. And we got funding, but it's amazing how much you can grow in a small space, and also how excited people get about it. And it's really interesting to learn. But if you really look at that a bit more closely, and the advances in using things like vertical farming and indoor food growing, I think it's going to be a really important part of resilience and food security, to start thinking about land and space in the city differently. And that could be rooftops. I mean, they do that, I think, a bit better in New York City, where you see actual whole glass houses on top of supermarkets growing things. You know, using the meanwhile spaces, I thought was really interesting. The skip garden at King's Cross, that's been in the meanwhile spaces as the site's been developed, and it was supplying organic food to all the posh restaurants in that area. So I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting engineering challenge in terms of nutrients to the plants and the footprint it needs, and light. You know, some of these are indoor situations, so they have no natural light. It's all artificial light. So I think that's really fascinating. And I think it could really change the way our cities feel and look.
That's fascinating. And I think that kind of, you know, growing in a space as well creates that sense of empowerment as well, which, you know, is going to be important, and kind of ownership of a space where, you know, we're kind of at a point people are getting pushed out. How do we make people feel like they own the space that they're in? So I think that's, yeah,
the food miles and transport, you know, grow it locally.
Definitely. And Stuart, I wonder, are there any engineering projects or wider projects that you think have an exciting potential to change our future?
Yeah, so I mean, I really like my bike, and I think over lockdown, sort of everyone sort of started to discover cycling around a bit more. It became a bit more mainstream, and I think some of the most exciting for me anyway, changes that we'll see in the city, I think engineering wise, will be some of the car-free initiatives we've got going on in London now, and some of the low traffic neighborhoods we've started to have. So at the moment, these are sort of quite temporary sort of trials, but I think going forward, we'll start to see more and more sort of cars secondary kind of infrastructure, sort of your pedestrian and your cycling or whatever it might be going forward, being the primary, and being in town. And that separation, I think there's quite a lot of debate about, is a bike lane really good enough for, is that safe enough, is that the best way? And going forward, I think our infrastructure will lean towards sort of separating the two out, and making it a lot more approachable, and having a lot nicer sort of street to walk down than the quite cramped sort of London streets we've got now, with you're sort of on this narrow path, but actually there's a 4-lane kind of like traffic down the middle. Is that the right thing for the future? Can cars just be put in a tunnel? Do they even need to drive down there, kind of thing? And we'll maybe see that going forward. I'm excited for that kind of future.
Yeah, definitely. As an asthmatic who can't drive, I would love that feature. And Emily, are there any exciting projects that pop to mind for you?
Well, as opposed to thinking of a project, like I see a future kind of shift in engineering attitude or focus, so that a lot of places that are currently in megacities that are just required as part of the basic infrastructure become kind of like a destination in their own right. So a transit zone, for example, a train station, no longer just becomes somewhere that you have to try and negotiate through to get to the next place, but that becomes part of your day, or it becomes an experience in itself. By doing that, something that I've noticed that we're starting to get a shift to, is making these sort of places completely inclusive. And I don't mean by having, for example, if you are in a wheelchair, it's not having a staircase and a ramp, so you have a choice. It's that you have no different experience as a person in a wheelchair, or a person who English is not your first language, or a person who has not got some of their senses. So every single person that walks through that station has exactly the same opportunity to the same experience. So no one is discriminated against. Like at the moment, we're in the transition where places can encompass all different types of people and people from all different backgrounds and walks of life. But I see a future where there's not even like options. Everyone has the same experience and nothing is like discounted for or is an exception to a rule. Yeah, so that's where I see it going in our megacities, is that everyone is just acting as one community.
Which would take kind of, you know, a beautiful path from the point that Carol brought up right in the beginning about diversity in engineering through to like, you know, experience for everybody in society. And I think Sprankenstein, if I ask you on a different note, I mean, do you think that it could benefit communities if there were more collaborations taking place between artists and scientists?
I think it couldn't not benefit to us. You're sort of igniting curiosities and making people think in different ways, and from like, you know, from the outside, even just making the tunnel, because we had to do it in a space where I'm living, and the amount of people sort of just coming in and trying to, you know, ask what was going on and getting involved, and it was just sort of people living on the streets. It wasn't artists or scientists or anything, and it just made a conversation that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't been there doing this collaboration, if we weren't here doing this today. And I think it is really important to also show that there are opportunities for different industries to cross over, and we're not just in our own echo chamber bubbles, you know, like Emily was saying. It's like there are a lot of similarities between science and art, and I think there can only be good things by continuing to work together and to create things that make people talk and consider things in a different way. Like, it certainly changed my mindset a lot on engineering, and I sort of knew about engineering before, so definitely is a benefit to communities, especially for like with the interactive stuff that I'm doing, and like having people come in and experience it, and it's like an education as well that is not sitting in well, can't sit in a schoolroom now, but you know, not a Google Classroom or reading a book kind of thing. I think it's really important to broaden, especially in 2020 where there's so much like visual food out there. This can only add to it.
Yeah, I love that phrase, kind of visual food. That's really food for thought. I'll definitely reflect on that one. Yeah, that's a lovely, like, hopeful vision, you know, for the project and beyond, I think. And Stephanie, I guess I'll ask you the same question. Yeah, what do you think could be those benefits to communities? I guess you've already seen a little bit of that with your physiotherapist friend.
Yeah, so I guess, I mean, in general, overall, I believe that to make a progressive and inclusive change in society, which benefits everyone in the community, I think collaboration across disciplines is essential. You know, it's as I think it was Stuart mentioned earlier, you know, just to avoid the kind of tunnel vision. I think he said, you know, being stuck in your own ideas. I think it's really important to sort of break those boundaries and barriers. And then when you're kind of thinking about science and art in that particular collaboration, I think, you know, science is about facts and art is about stories and poetry and reflection. And I think together they're able to kind of create new ways of reflecting and thinking and moving forward in unison. And so, yeah, so I think that there is a huge benefit for the community in all interdisciplinary collaborations, but I also, you know, specifically with science and art, I think it's very exciting. I mean, from my perspective as an artist, when I work with scientists, I'm always really inspired. I really enjoy deep diving in and asking questions and projecting imaginative perspectives and stories of this could be, what could this be, and how could it be? And then I also find it really, you know, interesting then when I take that conversation out and put it to the public and what they bring back to me that we that I didn't think of, and the scientists that I'm working with hadn't thought of. So yeah, conversations are key.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I think that concludes the the safe place of prepared questions. So now it's time to dive into our audience questions. So thank you so much for sending those in. I've seen we've got two. So the first one that I'll take is for Stuart and Emily in particular, and I'll read it out for you. Do you feel that the funding for major infrastructure projects being so London-centric due to its continual increase in size is fair, seeing as other regions of the UK are not receiving similar amounts and are thus running the risk of falling further and further behind? I'll go to Emily first, if you're happy.
Yeah, of course. So, well, the first thing, in my opinion, is the first bit of money needs to be used to make sure that everyone has access to the basic human needs. So as soon as you look at things like having a toilet that flushes, that costs a lot of money in a megacity. In a city like London, these things are expensive and they cost a lot the more people you've got in a more concentrated area. So the initial cost of basic needs is always going to draw to the bigger cities. But then I do agree that there's a kind of a balance between connecting London to other cities, so giving other cities the access to get there, but then also letting other cities and other areas develop. So yeah, I do see that other places in the country do need to have a more fair spending of money. But part of this project has made me realise that we shouldn't be looking at places independently. So London as a megacity will not be London and nothing around it. We're looking at the ways that the whole country can benefit from things that happen in London. So, and same with other places, we want other places to get better and to get more investment to help draw people out of megacities and increase other areas. So I do actually agree that there is some need for maybe some reshuffling of some money, but that's why we're engineers and not politicians.
Not yet.
We do what we're told. They give us the money, we don't decide what it's for.
I've just seen a question about where to get the meeting recording, and it should be going up on our YouTube. So yeah, keep your eyes peeled. We'll definitely post about it on social media just before I go to Stuart. Okay, so Stuart, your answer for this question as well. I think Emily's touched on some interesting points there.
Yeah, to be fair, I think it's a really good question, and it's an important in terms of fairness. You know, it can seem, I think, if you're outside of London, that all the money sort of pours into London in terms of investment. I think that possibly is changing. You know, going forward, we've got things like HS2 that's sort of trying to, as Emily was saying, sort of try and get the benefits of London and use that in other places by linking it up. And then you've got things like sort of Northern Powerhouse Rail, and if that kicks off and how that kicks off. I think that will start to link together at least parts of the north and really bring the wealth to the whole country rather than the sort of southeast centric kind of wealth center we've got now. So hopefully in the future, hopefully it's a bit more spread out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm not in charge of the money.
Definitely a fan of some redistribution of wealth, but it's not my Q&A, so I'll leave that there. So the other question that we had is for everybody. If you had to choose one mega project as a focus for everyone on the panel to work together on for the next year, what would it be? I love this question. I think it's great. I'll give you a bit of time to have a think. If anyone has an idea, then just shout out on the panel.
I have an idea that instead of creating a new project, part of it is using what we've got and trying to improve something. So, for example, there's a push in the industry to try and, instead of knocking down a building and rebuilding it, use it and make it better. So that's where the collaboration really comes in, and sometimes the creative thinking is really needed from the artists to help use what we've got. For example, like with brutalism and these sort of the Barbican places that are really trying to shift a negative image into something positive. And that is where I think we could all be working together a bit more to reduce waste and improve what we've got.
I think that's so right, Emily. I mean, we really need to retrofit our whole building stock so that it's not wasting energy. And also the embodied carbon in new buildings is just not going to be possible, really. We're running out of resource and time to address the climate emergency. I don't think that our government has a grasp on this right now. It is so urgent. I think that's a really good project, Emily.
And Sprankenstein, are you happy to chip in for the project as well? I think we've got something going here.
Yeah, I told you the itch is there. I'm in, count me in.
Stuart, are you in? Come on, we're assembling the Avengers now.
Yeah, I'm in. I personally think I like the idea, and I think from my sort of experience on sort of heavy civils, so like your rail and your sort of tunnel kind of thing, you sort of think about how much material sort of goes into that, and you're sort of thinking about it. You know, we always try and design things the most sustainable way, but having a bigger team and like a different kind of sphere of sort of ideas, maybe there's even better ways to build things and make it more sustainable going forward. So
yeah, and the pandemic turns everything on its head.
yeah, exactly.
Why
Do you need what you thought you needed before, and how
Yeah,
can
it
you?
changes everything.
The issue about the regions, about transport, everything is quite
And
different.
Stephanie, for you as well, are you joining us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great idea. I guess from my perspective, I think, you know, if we could all do like a mass audit of like how space and materials that already exist could be sort of reused on a local level, and kind of working with communities, I think that would be really interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. So thank you so much for sending in your questions. And just before we thank our speakers, we've put a link into the chat box, so a short feedback survey, and it would be great if you are happy to fill this in, because it helps us get more funding to continue developing projects like this. And yeah, put on events such as the Q&A, and if we're ever allowed, real life events as well. So yeah, thank you so much for coming to the Megacity London Engineering Our Future live Q&A. Thanks again to all of our fantastic speakers, artist and animator Sprankenstein, artist and designer Stephanie Bickford-Smith, Emily Farmer, graduate tunnel engineer from Mott MacDonald, Stuart Norris, structural engineer from Mott MacDonald, and Carol Costello, architect and director from Cullinan Studio. Thank you all so much.